Wow. You weren't kidding when you said this deep dive request was a big one. Windows Enterprise Network pen testing. Seriously.
It's a fascinating area. A lot to unpack, for sure.
You'd say that again. I mean, some of these file names alone. Exploitation techniques, PowerShell without PowerShell, even bypassing antivirus with C#. It's a bit intimidating.
We'll break it all down, don't worry. The goal is to highlight what's most important, right?
Yeah.
Especially for someone in your position, just getting up to speed.
Exactly. We're going for those aha moments without getting bogged down in every technical detail. Think of it as a crash course in, well, how to think like both the attacker and the defender when it comes to Windows security.
Like a digital game of chess, always thinking a few steps ahead.
Love that analogy. So to kick things off, we're diving headfirst into this Windows Enterprise Network Pentest PDF. Seems like a good starting point, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It lays out some of the core security features that are built right into Windows. The first line of defense, you could say.
Right, like the basics everyone should know, but maybe it needs a little refresher on. Because I'll be honest, looking through this, there are a lot of acronyms. AMSI, KeyCom, UAC. It's a lot to keep straight. Can you give us a quick rundown of what each of these actually does, without making our heads spin?
Absolutely. Let's start with AMSI, which stands for Anti-Malware Scan Interface.
Okay, I'm already lost. Anti-malware. What now?
Think of it like a security checkpoint for anything that wants to run on your system.
Right.
It lets applications and services talk to your antivirus, which can then scan for anything suspicious before it's allowed to run.
Oh, okay. So it's like having that extra layer of security at the door, making sure nothing shady gets in.
Precisely. Then there's COM, the component object model, which is basically how different parts of the Windows ecosystem talk to each other, like a network of bridges connecting all the different components.
Okay, I'm following so far. So AMSI is the bouncer, COM is the network of bridges. What's next?
Well, you know those annoying pop-ups you get asking if you want to allow a program to make changes to your computer?
Oh, right. User account control, UAC. I'll admit it, sometimes I just click yes without even thinking twice. Is that bad?
That's what attackers are hoping for. UAC is there for a reason. Even if some malware sneaks past other defenses, UAC acts as that final checkpoint, asking for permission before it can make any big changes.
So even if they get through the first door, UAC is like the security guard standing in front of the control panel saying, hold on, what are you doing here?
Exactly. And then to make things even more secure, there's AppLocker, which gives you more fine-grained control over which applications users can run in the first place.
So it's like a whitelist. You're on the list, you're good. You're not, sorry, no entry.
Precisely. And if you want to be extra cautious, there's always Windows Sandbox. It's like a mini, isolated version of Windows that runs within your main system. You can open risky files or visit sketchy websites in the sandbox without putting your actual computer at risk.
Ooh, I like that. Like a digital hazmat suit for handling potentially dangerous software. Brilliant.
Right. And these are just a few of the security features built into Windows. There's also WDEG, WDAC, WDAG, WSUS, each with its own specific role.
It's like trying to breach Fort Knox. But as you hinted at earlier, no system is perfect. So with all of these defenses in place, how do attackers actually get through? What are some common ways they bypass these protections?
Well, one way is by turning Windows' own tools against itself, finding and exploiting vulnerabilities in how the system works at a fundamental level. And that's where this whole Windows API abuse thing comes into play.
Windows API. It rings a bell, but I'll admit I need a little refresher. What is it exactly?
The Windows API, or Application Programming Interface, is essentially a set of pre-built functions that programmers use to interact with the Windows operating system.
Okay, so it's like a toolbox for building software. But how does that help an attacker?
Because attackers are, in a way, programmers too. They just use those same tools for different purposes to manipulate processes, hide malicious code, trick Windows into doing things it wasn't designed to do.
They're hacking the system by speaking its own language. That's pretty sneaky. Any examples of what this looks like in action? Something that would make our listeners go, whoa, that's clever, but also terrifying.
Well, in the Getting Windows to Play with Itself presentation you shared?
Getting Windows to Play with Itself. Now that's a title that grabs your attention.
Right. It talks about how attackers can abuse specific Windows API calls to basically inject malicious code into perfectly legitimate processes, making them unwitting accomplices in the attack.
So they're basically turning Windows against itself. That's both impressive and scary at the same time.
It really highlights how deep their understanding of the system goes.
Okay, so that's Windows API abuse. What other tricks are up their sleeves? I know we've only scratched the surface here.
Well, they also like to use powerful programming languages, like C# to create malware.
Wait, C# for creating malware? Isn't that more for, legitimate software development?
It's a versatile language. It
Yeah.
lets attackers write code that's very good at evading detection. So, yes, offensive C# is a real thing, unfortunately.
Offensive C#. I'll never look at C# the same way again.
Hmm?
What else? This is all a bit overwhelming.
Remember we talked about processes earlier? Well, there's this thing called process injection. Basically, it's a way for attackers to hide their malicious code within a legitimate process.
So like a virus disguising itself as a healthy cell.
Exactly. It's like blending into a crowd. They can do things like inject malicious code into our running process or even create a brand new process that looks harmless but is actually running their malicious code in the background.
Wow. Process hollowing, they call it, right?
Yeah.
It's like they're puppeteering legitimate programs to do their bidding.
It's pretty creepy when you think about it. And it can be a real challenge to defend against. You need a deep understanding of how Windows works at a low level to even spot that something's off.
Speaking of challenging to defend against, I was looking through those resources you sent, and one thing that really caught my eye was the section on bypassing Windows account security. I mean, I thought things like UAC were supposed to prevent that kind of unauthorized access. How do they get around it?
Attackers are always looking for ways to escalate privileges, even with UAC in place. Things like TPM bypasses, for example, can be particularly tricky.
Right, TPM bypasses. I'm definitely seeing a pattern here. Attackers love finding those tiny cracks in the system and exploiting them.
It's a constant arms race. But speaking of cracks in the system, remember earlier when we talked about fileless attacks?
Right, those attacks that are like ghosts, leaving no trace. You're not going to tell me that even those supposedly robust security features like WDAC and AppLocker can be bypassed, are you? They sounded pretty ironclad to me.
They are powerful, but they're not foolproof. Attackers have found ways to get around them. They might manipulate file attributes, find subtle misconfigurations, or even use legitimate applications in unexpected ways.
So even those tools that are supposed to be the defender's best friends can be turned against them.
Exactly, and that's where Allbest comes into play. It's all about using legitimate Windows tools like PowerShell or WMI for malicious purposes.
Living off the land binaries and scripts, it does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it?
It's a good way to blend in. They're not introducing anything new to the system. They're just twisting what's already there.
And that's what makes it so difficult to detect, right? Because it all looks like normal activity.
Yeah.
Okay, my head is spinning a bit now. We've covered API abuse, process injection, account bypasses, fileless attacks, all waste. What else is there?
Well, remember that PowerShell without PowerShell thing we talked about earlier? It's exactly as mind-boggling as it sounds.
Oh, right, that. I'm almost afraid to ask, but how is that even possible? It's like saying you can drive a car without an engine.
Let's just say there are ways to execute PowerShell code without actually calling PowerShell.exe directly. They might embed it in other file types like Office documents or use other system features to disguise its execution.
Okay, now that is just plain sneaky. They're like digital ninjas hiding in the shadows, using every trick in the book. I am both impressed and terrified.
And on that note, I think it's time for a quick break. We've covered a lot of ground, and we've still got one more big topic to tackle, the potential for those software updates we all rely on to be compromised themselves.
Oh no, not the updates. I don't know if my nerves can handle this. Don't go anywhere, folks. This deep dive is about to get even more intense. Okay, I think I'm ready for the final blow. We're about to dive into the world of compromised updates, right? I have to admit, this one really has me worried.
It's definitely an area that doesn't get as much attention as it should. But you're right, the potential for software updates to be compromised is a huge deal.
We're talking specifically about WSUS, right? Windows Server Update Services.
Exactly. It's used in so many organizations to manage updates. And if an attacker can compromise the WSUS server itself,
Game over.
pretty much, they'd have the keys to the kingdom. They could push malware disguised as legitimate updates, replace updates with older, vulnerable versions.
It'd be like replacing everyone's flu shots with, I don't even want to think about it. Talk about a worst-case scenario.
And the worst part is, it can be incredibly difficult to detect. Most people just assume updates from their WSUS server are safe.
So how do we defend against this? How do we make sure our updates are actually keeping us safe, not leading us into a trap?
Well, first and foremost, treat your WSUS server like the crown jewels. Strong passwords, limited access, all the security best practices.
Lock it down tight. Got it.
What else? Monitoring is key. You need to be able to spot any suspicious activity, like unexpected updates being pushed or changes to the server configuration.
So we need to be watching for anything out of the ordinary. Any other tips?
Signed updates are your friend.
Signed updates, like a
Yeah.
digital signature.
Exactly. It's an extra layer of verification that the update is legitimate and hasn't been tampered with.
Makes sense. So we need to lock down the server, monitor for suspicious activity, and use signed updates whenever possible. Anything else?
There are also some great tools out there that can help, like PyWSUS, which can be used for both managing and security testing your WSUS environment.
PyWSUS. I'll have to check that out. It's amazing how many tools are out there these days. But I guess that's the nature of cybersecurity, always evolving.
Exactly. The more you know about the threats, the tools, the techniques, the better prepared you'll be.
Knowledge is power, right?
Huh.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about today. Windows API abuse, fileless attacks, LOLNS, compromised updates. Who knew there were so many ways to attack a Windows system?
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, don't scare me. But seriously, this has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for walking me through all of this. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
My pleasure. Glad we could shed some light on this critical and often overlooked area of cybersecurity.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this wild ride through the world of Windows security. Stay safe out there, and remember, knowledge is your best defense.